Well, good morning. It's very nice to see everybody here on this beautiful day. It is the Lord's Day. We give God credit for all things, and we're here to worship Him, to honor Him, and adore Him. But it also happens to be Mother's Day as well. And sometimes there are periods in our life, or days, vacations we go on, or events that make us more aware of our blessings than at other times. And I do believe Mother's Day is one of those times where we're simply reminded of the great things that we have had in life, especially pertaining to our mothers. Now, I've been aware of that this weekend also. I've had a house full of blessings. My aunt and uncle, John and Barb, and my parents, Paul and Terry, have come into town for the weekend, so it's very good to see them. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Mother's Day on a day when I had my own mother and my Aunt Barb, who is a very important woman in my life, as well as the mother of my children, all in the same room. On Friday night, we also had my mother-in-law, Susan, come over for dinner. So when you have your mom, your wife, your aunt, and your mother-in-law all in town having dinner at your house, again, it makes you so aware of how incredibly blessed you are. So I would like to talk about moms today. I would like to talk about moms. But let's begin with the idea that Mother's Day is not always a pleasant experience for some people. And I wonder, why would Mother's Day not be a pleasant experience or a pleasant reminder for somebody? Well, first of all, it's not a pleasant experience for people who have had painful reminders every Mother's Day of the loss that they've had if your own mother has passed away. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge every year, just like it is on Valentine's Day, for people who've lost a loved one, on Father's Day for people who've lost their fathers, on a loved one's birthday every year as it rolls around, or even the anniversary of a person's passing. It's difficult as we go through the year and we encounter these dates every single year that remind us of the people that we've lost. So if you've lost your mother, then I'm sympathetic to you. And I don't intend to rub salt into an open wound by talking about mothers on this day. But I do think that we have to give our mothers credit. That even if we have lost them, we give them so much credit. We honor our father and our mother, I think, even in their death. Even in their death. Now, the connection between a child and his or her mother is so deep. It's a connection and a relationship that's incomparable. There's no other relationship that can compare to it. So it would only be natural for us to carry the grief of that loss, the grief of that passing for the rest of our lives. But one word of warning every Mother's Day when it rolls around: be very careful that you don't allow your grief to put a damper on everybody else's enjoyment of that day. Now again, I say that with all the sympathy in the world, but sometimes what happens is we carry our grief through us throughout life, and every time somebody celebrates a wedding, we turn it into an opportunity to talk about the loved one that we have lost, or a divorce or a broken marriage that we've experienced. Every time somebody celebrates a birthday, we talk about all the birthdays that people have forgotten about in our lives. Well, no one remembered my birthday this year. We need to be very careful that when Mother's Day and Father's Day, when these kinds of days roll around, that we laugh when others are laughing. We rejoice when others are rejoicing, just as they wept when we lost that loved one, just like it says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. Notice that that verse goes both ways. You weep when others weep. Even if you don't feel like weeping, you weep because it's the right thing to do for them. But you also laugh or rejoice when others are laughing and rejoicing, even if you personally don't feel like laughing or rejoicing. It goes both ways for us, my friends. But the second point I would make is that you might have regret over a broken relationship. Perhaps Mother's Day is a reminder that you only have so much time in life to mend a broken relationship with your mother. And every time Mother's Day rolls around, it's a reminder that you've just spent another year feeling bitter or angry toward a mother who did not live up to expectations or did not treat you the way that you deserved to be treated. Now that's another year that's gone by. And if you allow the next Mother's Day to roll by without saying what needs to be said, without mending the fences that needed to be mended, then you have wasted yet another year in one of the most important relationships that a human can experience. But you might also have disappointment with your mother. Because your mother might have been deeply disappointing in some way in how she took care of you or didn't take care of you, in the priorities that she placed in her life, things that were ahead of you, things that were more important to her than you. And that's a reality, isn't it? Because not every mother lives up to the expectation. Now, not every mother is perfect. I don't think any mother is perfect. But if you've been hurt by a mother, if you've been hurt by a lifetime of bad experiences in your relationship with your parents, your mother or your father, either one, then please keep this in mind. Don't let her bitterness become your bitterness. Don't let her mistakes become your mistakes. Her failures should never become your failures. And I'm reminded of the story of Ruth and how her mother-in-law, Naomi, I know it was her mother-in-law, I understand that. But as you read the story of Ruth, you see that Ruth took Naomi as if she was her own mother. They shared such a close relationship that Naomi might as well have been her own mother. And when they get back to Bethlehem, after losing everything, what's Naomi's attitude toward the other people in town? They say, "Is that Naomi? Could that possibly be Naomi?" Her physical appearance had changed so much in her grief that they wondered if it was in fact Naomi. And she says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore," which means sweet. Actually, just start calling me Mara, which means bitter. Because I went out full from Bethlehem. I went out full, and I came back empty. Which always makes you wonder, right? With Ruth standing in the background going, "Yeah, and I'm the daughter-in-law Ruth over here." Naomi said, "I went out full. I went out with a husband and 2 healthy sons, and I came back empty. You know, except for this daughter-in-law who followed me back here like a puppy." And it makes you wonder, what did Ruth think about that? What did Ruth think about a mother-in-law who wanted to change her name to Bitter because of her life situation? But does Ruth carry her mother-in-law's bitterness? No, in fact, the very next chapter begins with Ruth seeking an opportunity to help take care of the family because somebody's got to put food on the table, and it might as well be me. Don't let your mother's mistakes, your mother's bitterness, her jaded attitude toward this or that, don't carry that into your life as well, especially in the way that you parent your own children. Now, that's the bad part of the lesson, right? That's the part where we have to acknowledge that mothers make mistakes also. There's a really good side to it as well, because we don't celebrate Mother's Day to talk about the mistakes that our mothers made. We talk about Mother's Day to talk about all the good things that they did. We read in Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, that we're to honor our father and our mother. And notice the way Paul puts it here. And this, by the way, is a quote from the Old Testament. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." I love that, by the way. He says, "For this is right." It's one of those great self-explanatory things. He doesn't have to offer a bunch of proof. He doesn't have to offer a bunch of reasons. He says, obey your parents because it's right. It is one of those things in life that is simply right. It's self-explanatory. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. And people will ask the question, going back to our first point in this lesson, well, what if my father and my mother don't deserve honor? What if they didn't live in a way where they warranted any kind of honor? Well, we'll deal with that here in a few moments. Ephesians 6 is a quotation from the Old Testament, so you can read in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12 or Deuteronomy 5 and verse 16 of what God had to say in the Old Law about the requirement. And it was a requirement. Not a suggestion, not a good idea, but a commandment. Honor your father and your mother. Jesus is the Son of God, and yet even the Son of God, unabashedly, without any shame at all, without any embarrassment whatsoever, honored His earthly mother. And I find that very amazing, that the Son of God, who was at the right hand of God, who was there in the creation, who was creating the world by His own power, came to earth in the form of a little tiny baby, born of a woman according to Galatians chapter 4. humble, small, physical, limited. And the Son of God honored his mother. Now, there are a couple of verses that sometimes people look at and say, well, maybe he didn't honor his mother so much. For example, in John chapter 2, he calls her woman when she goes to him at the wedding feast at Cana and it shows to him this problem that they're having. He says, woman. And people say, well, what does that mean? Is that a word of disrespect there? In fact, the word that's used there, woman, in the original language is an incredibly honorable term. It's a word of respect, maybe akin to what we would say is lady or ma'am today, but with even more emphasis on the respect. So actually, in a verse that seems like he's not honoring his mother, he is in fact giving her great honor. And the same goes with Luke chapter 8, verse 21. When his mother and his other family members, his siblings, were coming to him, there's a great crowd of people. They wanted to see Jesus, and people said, your mother and your brothers are outside. Should we let them in? And he says, look around you. The people who listen to my words, these are my mother and my brothers and my sisters. And some people look at that, again, as a dismissal. But here's what I'm saying. I don't see that as a dismissal at all. I see that rather as quite a bold statement about us as believers. He's not saying that my mother and my brother and my sisters are way down here along with all the other people I don't know, the complete strangers in my life. Actually, what he's saying is the opposite of that. He's saying, actually, believers in me, even people who I don't know personally, even people who aren't physically related to me, believers who will come 2,000 years later, I honor them as much as I honor my mother and my brother and my sisters. Think about that. He loves us as much as he loved his own mother and his brothers and his sisters in the flesh. He loves us as much as he loved them. And he died for their sins just as much as he died for our sins on the cross. Something we don't always think about. And of course, it was on the cross in his last moments that the last thing that he was concerned about, one of the last things that he said as he was dying, was to make sure that his own mother was taken care of by somebody that he trusted. We honor our mothers because we owe them life. Even if they did not live up to expectations, even if they failed in some way as a parent, as a caregiver, as a role model, we still honor them, and that's why it's a command. Honor your father and your mother, because if it wasn't for them, you wouldn't even exist. And if that's the very least that somebody could do for you in life, they have done something that no one else could have done. So we honor them because we owe our mothers our very existence. And should not such a fundamental gift be met with fundamental love and dignity, if not affection or approval of bad choices, if that happens to be the case in your own experiences? So I want to talk about what I love about my mom. And she's going to be upset by that. I'm not looking at her right now. Because would you believe that I married a woman who was very similar to my mother? In fact, when a mutual friend wanted to set us up, one of the first things that she said about Rebecca was, she's just like your mom, you're going to love her. And Rebecca doesn't like being in the spotlight, so my mom doesn't like being in the spotlight anymore. So I'm going to embarrass her a little bit here with a few minutes of discussion about what I love about my mom. And I hope you'll certainly see that as we go through these things, these are scriptural ideas. It's not that I love them about my mom only. I hope that you can see these are things I love about all mothers. I just can only speak from personal experience when I say that my mom happens to be the best one. My mother taught us true wisdom. And what I mean by that is godly wisdom. She didn't just give us her opinion about things. She didn't just give us information about what happened to be in vogue at the time, whatever worldly philosophy, whatever parenting advice happened to be popular at the moment. She taught us true wisdom. Notice in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8, the connection between wisdom and teaching and our parents. And there's a mention here of both the father and the mother in this verse. And I think it's important for us to see this. Proverbs 1 and verse 8 says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they're a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. Your father teaches and your mother teaches as well. I think that's a really important point that we need to keep in mind in our own parenting, is that both mother and father have a role to play in teaching children, teaching them about God, teaching them about life, teaching them about proper priorities, true wisdom. But also go further on the book of Proverbs to chapter 6 and verse 20. It says here in chapter 6, verse 20, "My son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother." And if your mother is teaching you true and godly wisdom, then it is also timeless wisdom. It's timeless. Because what God said 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, what God said at the very beginning, writing through Moses in the book of Genesis, that is as true today as it ever has been. And it will always be true from generation to generation until God comes back to judge this world. And the great thing about true wisdom is that it lasts. The great thing about true wisdom is that it doesn't have to be in vogue. It doesn't have to be popular. It doesn't have to be presented in a New York Times bestseller book to be true wisdom. She taught us true wisdom. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. You notice that the book of Proverbs ends in chapter 31 with an ode to the great woman here. Now, she's a great woman in everything that she does. She's great in the work that she does with her hands, the business that she conducts in the community, her relationship to her husband, and her relationship to her children. It says in Proverbs 31 and verse 26 that she opens her mouth in wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. What my mother said and what my father said were never contradictory either. Now, they might have disagreed about things at times, but it was never in front of us. And we were never able to pit them against each other, which kids want to do that. That's the default setting for children, isn't it? To pit parents against each other. Well, that's not what Dad said. Or you get an answer from one parent that you don't like, so you secretly go to the other one before they have a chance to tell each other about it. They were never able to be pitted against each other. They were always on the same page, and I know they probably disagreed on some things at some point in raising us, but it was always behind closed doors. It was always when we weren't there to listen. They presented a united front. So what Mom taught and what Dad taught were always the same thing. It was always the same wisdom. And it had as its ultimate source the one who gives all wisdom to all people. She took religious knowledge seriously as well. You saw Mom studying her Bible. In fact, yesterday morning she actually had her Bible open at breakfast time. I believe it was breakfast or lunch, right around early in the day. You saw Mom studying her Bible, and she took it seriously. Bible study wasn't a hobby. Bible study wasn't just some endless pursuit of some kind. It wasn't meaningless to her. It wasn't a means to an end of some kind, unless it was heaven. She took religious knowledge seriously, and she expected us to take it seriously as well. But the second thing that I love about my mom is that she always treasured things in her heart. 2 Bible verses that have always reminded me of my mother. And I know it's quite a lofty thing to say, but I'm sure any son or daughter would say the same thing to a mother they love and honor. But when I read about the story of Mary, I see my mother so much in every part of Mary's story. The humility and the strength of character. So when it talks about Mary here in Luke chapter 2, notice here in verse 16 what it has to say here. And there's a phrase I want to seize upon. It says here that they came in haste and found their way to Mary and Joseph. These are the shepherds, by the way, who had been talked to by the angels, who said that something glorious was going to happen. They came in haste and they found their way to Mary and Joseph and the baby as he lay in the manger. And when they had when they had seen this, they made known the statement which had been told them about this child by the angels. And all who heard it wondered at the things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary treasured up all of these things, pondering them in her heart. I've always loved that phrase. While everybody else is in a frenzy, trying to figure out what it means. What did these people say? What are the implications of it? Mary is in the background, holding her newborn baby, looking into his eyes, pondering, treasuring, recording every memory as if it was a keepsake. But it says the same thing later on in chapter 2 and verse 51. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to him, that is his earthly parents, Mary and Joseph. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. That phrase, treasured all these things in her heart, I think that's a talent that mothers have that fathers are not quite as good at. And we'll talk about some other things that fathers aren't quite as good at in the next point as well, by the way. Because I'm willing to admit areas where I'm not as good at things as Rebecca or my mother. But I think that's a particular skill that women have to treasure things up in their heart. While men tend to look at the next phase of life, right? As soon as your kid graduates from kindergarten, you're already looking at, well, what's the next thing? Where's he going to go now? What's the next thing on the list? What's the next thing on the agenda? We went to a motorcycle race yesterday, and Dave Sparks went with us. He's an honorary Goodwin for the weekend. And as John and my dad were rushing to get back to their seats after getting ice cream or whatever, they were so far ahead of us, and Sterling was struggling to keep them. I said, Dave, it was like this every family vacation that we went to. You go to Disneyland, there's something about a Goodwin man, and he's shuffle running his way to the next ride. Come on, come on, come on, kids. Dads are always looking for the next thing. They finish up a ride, they finish up an activity, and they're ready to look at the next thing. Mothers, on the other hand, and this is not everybody, it's a generalization, I know. I think mothers, like Mary in Luke chapter 2, they tend to slow down a little bit. And they treasure things in their heart. And they take little memories and they tuck them away in their pocket for years later. Rebecca remembers things about our children that if she hadn't reminded me, it would have passed into obscurity long ago. You remember the way when he was a baby that he used to make this noise that was so cute? Do you remember the way when she was a toddler she used to say that word in a funny way? You remember the way that she used to eat in this way? Little things in life. And I love that my mother treasured up those things and has those memories that I'm never going to remember again. But not only that, I love the modesty of my mother's heart. A true modesty. A modesty that comes from the inside out, that is of the character. Now, if you see, we talk about modesty in the context of things like clothes and the kind of things that we wear. I understand that, but modesty is not clothes. Modesty is not an exterior thing. Modesty is an interior thing. It is a part of the character that then emanates out and reveals itself in how we appear on the outside. My mother was modest in her heart. Mary, Jesus' own mother, will always be remembered for her role in the gospel story. And you can read about that in Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 1 verse 42. But she never thought of herself more highly than she should have. Look here in Luke chapter 1, beginning in verse 46. And this is what Mary had to say after she went to see her cousin Elizabeth. My soul exalts the Lord, and my spirit has rejoiced in God my Savior. For he has had regard for the humble state of his bondslave. For behold, from this time on, all generations will count me blessed. What do you think she thought of herself? When the angel talked to her earlier on in the chapter, this is what he had to say in verse 28. Hail, favored one, the Lord is with you. And she was greatly troubled by this statement, it says in verse 29. Maybe she was greatly troubled by that statement because she was so humble in her heart that an angel telling her that she was a favored one and the Lord was with her was just too much for her to handle. And when she goes to see her cousin Elizabeth, the baby in Elizabeth's womb, John the Baptist, jumps for joy in the womb. And Elizabeth says, what a glorious thing this is to see you. The baby knows exactly who you are and who you're carrying in your womb. And the very next thing that Mary does is says, well, I give God all the credit because all I am is a bondservant. God is the one who should be exalted, not me. All I am is a vessel for God's child. He is exalted. I am a bondservant. I'm a bondservant who has been raised up to do something truly glorious, but all the glory still needs to go to God. Mary didn't see herself as any more special than any other person who'd ever come before, man or woman. She simply saw herself as one part of the larger gospel story. Now, some women are very outgoing and others are not. That's simply a matter of personality. You could look at the difference between my mother and my aunt to see the difference in personalities. And it's a beautiful thing that there are all kinds of women in the world, and it's a beautiful thing that there are all kinds of mothers in the world. And you can be the very best mother that you can be with your personality. Own it. Make it your own. Leave your stamp on your children with the talents and the gifts that you have. But all people can and should be humble. No matter what your personality is, humility must be at the core of everything that you do in raising your children, in loving your husband, in serving the Lord. It must be with all humility, as if you were serving God Himself, like Colossians chapter 3 says. Whatever you do, in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord. And my mother is not one to occupy the spotlight. That's partly because of her personality. She's a very modest person. She's a very quiet person. But I think it's mostly because Jesus is the one who deserves all the attention. So I have this to say. Jesus is first in my mother's life, and that's the thing I admire about her most of all. So I suppose the nicest thing that I could do on Mother's Day in a lesson about my mother is to stop talking about my mother and talk about Jesus. I think that that is what she would want more than anything else. So let us talk about Jesus for a few minutes. Jesus who loved and honored His own earthly mother. Jesus who loved and honored all mothers after that by coming to this world, dying for our sins, and being raised up in newness of life that we might all have the hope of resurrection one day. He did that for mothers, He did that for fathers, He did that for single people, for young and old, for people in His time period and those who would come 2,000 years later seeking the same gospel truth. Jesus is at the heart of all of our lives. And like I said at the beginning of the lesson, it's Mother's Day. But it was the Lord's Day a long time before anybody ever said today was Mother's Day. This is the Lord's Day, so we honor Him. We honor Him by partaking of the Lord's Supper. We honor Him by studying His Word. We honor Him by living for Him in everything that we do. Let's end with Galatians chapter 2. For the sake of time, let's end with Galatians chapter 2. I don't know that we've studied this recently, but I love the sentiment that Paul offers here in summing up the kind of life that he wanted to live. He has this to say in Galatians 2 and verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and delivered Himself up for me. So like any mother who does not want to take any credit from God, Paul the Apostle also says, it's not about me. And Paul could have taken a lot of credit, couldn't he? He could have taken credit for all the churches that he planted, for all the people that he had talked to about the gospel, all those who had been saved as a direct result of his preaching. And he could have taken a lot of credit and made himself out to be something more important than he was. But he says, my life was nailed to the cross along with Jesus. And any life that I now live, every breath that I now take, every step that I take in this life, it's all for Jesus now. Can you say the same thing? So on this Lord's Day, will you put God first in your life and love Him more than anything else? Will you love Jesus more than you love your own mother? Will you love Jesus more than you love your own children? If you do, then let that be known. Whatever spiritual need you have, please come forward as we stand and sing.